Okay, so most people know about the Cold War, the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union after World War II. Most people also know about the arms race, the fact that both sides built up huge arsenals of nuclear weapons, enough to destroy the planet several times over. But while everyone knows about these big things, details are often forgotten. And one of those details is a lesser-known story that took place in the Pacific Northwest. During the 1940s and 50s, a story about a top-secret mission, a radioactive cloud, and an entire town that was unknowingly exposed to radiation. Before I get started, if you're new here, welcome to my channel. This is a story of Operation Green Run. To understand what happened, we need to go back to the 1940s. The United States had just dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, ending World War II. But soon after, the country found itself in another kind of war. The Cold War. This was a period of tension and mistrust between the US and the Soviet Union. Both sides wanted to be the most powerful nation in the world, and they did everything they could to get ahead. In order to do that, they developed new technologies, conducted secret missions, and built up huge stockpiles of nuclear weapons. In the middle of all this was a small town in Washington state called Richland. Today, it's a quiet community of about 55,000 people. But during the Cold War, it was at the center of a top-secret nuclear facility called the Hanford Site. Over the course of several decades, this facility produced plutonium for dozens of nuclear weapons. But while making these weapons, scientists had a problem. They needed to know more about nuclear particles and how they moved through the environment. Specifically, they wanted to know what would happen if radioactive particles were released into the air. But they didn't want to use animals or test dummies. They wanted real-world results. So they decided to use the nearby town and its residents. As you can imagine, this was not done with the town's knowledge or consent. In fact, the people living near Richland had no idea they were being used as human test subjects. In December of 1949, the scientists at the Hanford site released a radioactive cloud containing thousands of curies of iodine-131. To put that number in perspective, 1 curie is equal to 37 billion disintegrations of radioactive material per second. Thousands of curies is a lot of radiation. The goal of this experiment was to see how far the cloud would travel, how quickly it would decay, and what effect it would have on people, animals, and crops. Now, keep in mind, at this time, nuclear energy was still relatively new. No one really knew how dangerous it was or how to protect themselves from it. But the scientists at Hanford did know that the radioactive particles would eventually drift back to the Earth. They knew it would fall to the ground along a path called the fallout pathway. But they weren't sure where that path would lead. What they needed was a little bit of help from Mother Nature. Specifically, the wind. As soon as the radioactive cloud was released, the winds picked it up and carried it across eastern Washington. This meant that the radiation spread much further and faster than the scientists expected. Within hours, it reached the nearest town, which was called Kennewick. At this point, the cloud contained about 20% of its original radioactivity. As it continued on its journey, the wind began to die down and the radiation eventually settled onto the ground, covering an area of about 6,000 square miles. During its path, it traveled over farms, homes, rivers, and even schools. It rained down on everything below it. And by the time it was done, it contaminated everything in its path. But back at the lab, none of this mattered. The scientists at Hanford saw the data they needed and shut down their experiment. Now, you may be wondering why they did something so dangerous, why they put an entire town at risk when they could have easily contained the experiment. Well, at the time, the US government was terrified of the Soviet Union. They were desperate to get ahead in the nuclear arms race, and they thought that knowledge was power. They believed that if they understood how radiation worked, they could build better bombs and become the most powerful nation in the world. Of course! This line of thinking eventually led to disaster, but at the time, it made sense. After all, in 1945, the United States had dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, killing tens of thousands of people. 3 years later, they were testing weapons that could kill millions. In fact, throughout the 1950s, the US conducted dozens of nuclear tests in the Pacific Ocean. Some of these tests were small, while others involved detonating dozens of bombs at the same time. The largest nuke ever detonated on the planet was dropped over the Marshall Islands in 1954. It was called Castle Bravo, and it destroyed 3 entire atoms. This test was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that devastated Hiroshima. It unleashed more radiation in less than 30 seconds than the sun produces in months. The blast was so strong that it triggered a tsunami that killed 200 people. The explosion also spewed radioactive debris high into the atmosphere. This debris circled the globe and fell over countries who had nothing to do with the test. So given the destructive nature of nuclear weapons, it's not hard to understand why the US government was so secretive about Operation Green Run. In the context of the Cold War, releasing a small amount of radiation into the environment seemed like a harmless experiment. But even though the government didn't think it was dangerous, it turns out that it very much was. Within days of the experiment, local farmers reported that livestock had fallen sick and died. Soon after, they noticed that their crops weren't growing properly either. These problems got worse over the years. Thyroid cancer rates increased in children, and many families lost multiple generations of women to cancer. The worst part is that no one realized what was happening. For decades, the people living near Richland struggled with unexplained health issues. They watched loved ones suffer and die without understanding why. You see, the radioactive cloud released by the Hanford site contained iodine 1031, a substance commonly found in dairy products. This meant that when the cloud settled onto the ground, it contaminated the local food supply. This contamination then made its way into the bodies of farm animals and eventually into the people who consumed them. It's called the food chain effect, and it's a well-known hazard of nuclear contamination. This is why even today, people are warned to stay away from certain fish if they live near a nuclear reactor. But back in the 1940s and 50s, no one understood any of this. People simply did not know how radiation affected the body or what to do if they were exposed to it. This was especially true in places like here. The radioactive cloud didn't just contaminate the food supply, it also seeped into the ground and local water sources. This meant that people were exposed to radiation from more than one source. Also, the cloud hit during the winter. At first, this seemed like a lucky break. After all, if it had rained during the summer, it could have contaminated the crops directly. But it turned out that this was actually a worst-case scenario. You see, during the winter, farmlands are covered in snow, so any contaminants are usually safe. But this didn't apply to the water. When the snow melted, it ran into the rivers, lakes, and groundwater, contaminating the entire region's water supply. And since no one knew about the experiment, people drank, cooked, and washed their clothes in radioactive water without even realizing it. When the snow eventually melted, the river water carried radioactive contamination downstream, affecting communities as far away as Pasco and Findlay, Washington. Even today, scientists are still studying the effects of Operation Green Run. They're working to determine how long it will take for the environment to recover. They're also looking into the health effects of exposure, even low-level exposure. So far, they've found links between the experiment and thyroid cancer, as well as a variety of other health problems. But they're still learning about how radiation affects the body long-term. So how come we only know about this now? Why did it take so long for the truth to come out? Well, the answer is simple. It was a top-secret mission. The government didn't want anyone to know about it. Not the people living near Richland. Not other nations, and definitely not the Soviet Union. Given the sensitive nature of nuclear weapons, this makes sense, but it also led to some terrible consequences. In the decades following Operation Green Run, many people fell ill. Their doctors had no idea what was causing their mysterious illnesses, and the government was even less helpful. Officials knew that the cloud contained radioactive iodine, but they never informed the public. In fact, it wasn't until the 1980s that the truth began to come out. Around this time, former employees of the Hanford site began speaking out. They told stories of a secret experiment in a radioactive cloud. Soon after, records were declassified and lawsuits were filed. The people living near Richland finally learned the truth. But at this point, it was too late. Thousands of people had been exposed to radiation without knowing it. Many of them had already suffered serious health problems. Since then, the government has spent billions of dollars cleaning up the Hanford site. but there's still a lot of work left to do. Right now, the site is one of the most contaminated nuclear facilities in the world. It covers an area of about 580 square miles, which is larger than the entire city of New York. This vast space is filled with underground tanks, some of which contain highly radioactive waste. And while the government is working to clean up this mess, they haven't been able to fix the damage done to the people living near Richland. Thousands of men, women, and children were exposed to radiation without knowing it. And while many of them have since passed away, their story still serves as a reminder of the dangers of nuclear weapons. If you want to learn more about Operation Green Run, I put a ton of information in the description box below. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. It helps me out a lot. Thanks for watching.